The midwife's hands trembled as another scream tore through Pembroke Castle's ancient stones. January wind howled through the arrow slits, but inside the birthing chamber, 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort burned with fever. This wasn't how childbirth was supposed to go. Women laboured for hours, yes, but women, not children whose bodies hadn't finished growing. 18 hours. That's how long the future King of England's grandmother had been fighting to bring him into the world. Each contraction ripped through her small frame like siege engines against castle walls. The midwife had stopped meeting anyone's eyes after hour 6. Everyone in that chamber knew the truth, hanging heavy as iron chains. When children bore children, usually neither survived. Blood soaked through fresh linens faster than servants could replace them. Margaret's hip bones, still forming, still child narrow, were cracking under pressure they were never meant to bear. The damage happening inside her body would last forever. She'd never carry another child. This baby, if it lived, would be her only chance at motherhood, her only heir, her only hope. But Margaret Beaufort wasn't screaming just from pain. With each wave of agony, she was forging something harder than castle stone, a will that would topple kingdoms and crown her son King of England. Every tear that fell onto blood-stained sheets was building a dynasty. The Tudors were being born in this chamber, written in the destruction of a child's body. How did a girl sold into marriage at 12 become the most powerful woman in England? And why did the very system that brutalized her body become the tool she'd wield to crown her son? To understand how this bloodied child in Pembroke Castle would topple kings, we need to rewind to when she was just property with a prestigious bloodline, and discover why Margaret Beaufort's tragedy began before she could even write her own name. The messenger's boots were still caked with French mud when he delivered the news. John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was dead at 38, leaving behind a 1-year-old daughter and whispers of suicide. May 1444. Somerset's death shook England's noble households, but not from grief. The Duke had died in disgrace, his military failures in France staining the Beaufort name like spilled wine on silk. Some said poison. Others whispered he'd taken his own life, rather than face another failed campaign. What everyone agreed on was this: baby Margaret had inherited a cursed legacy. The Beaufort line carried royal blood, illegitimate, but royal nonetheless. John of Gaunt's bastard children had been legitimised by Parliament, making them almost princes, never quite royalty. That blood made Margaret valuable. Her father's failures made her vulnerable, but Somerset's enemies weren't finished with the Beauforts yet. Inside Bletsoe Castle, Margaret's mother, Margaret's, barely 21 herself, counted coins and calculated survival. The Duchess of Somerset had become a widow with a baby girl worth her weight in political gold. Noble vultures were already circling. Without a father's protection, Margaret was now a ward of the crown. The king could sell her marriage to whoever offered the most. The math was simple. Noble girls equaled alliances. Their wombs were peace treaties waiting to be signed. Their bloodlines were weapons in the constant war between England's great houses. Margaret Beaufort, at 1-year-old, had become merchandise in the marriage market that traded children like cattle. What Margaret's mother discovered in her late husband's papers would haunt them both. Hidden among Somerset's military dispatches were desperate letters, begging letters. The late Duke had gambled everything on French victories that never came. The Beaufort fortune was hemorrhaging gold faster than a severed artery. Without money, even royal blood couldn't protect them from the wolves gathering at their gates. The Duchess did what desperate mothers do. She started negotiating. Not for love, not for happiness, but for survival. Letters flew between castles like trained hawks. Which great lord would pay the most for a baby bride with Beaufort blood? The bidding war for Margaret's future had begun before she could walk. The king's solution for the Beaufort problem would make a 1-year-old girl the most valuable pawn in England. King Henry VI, weak-minded and easily led, saw opportunity in the Beaufort baby. Here was a chance to reward loyalty and punish enemies, all through one tiny girl's future marriage. His courtiers whispered suggestions. His queen whispered louder. Everyone wanted to control who would eventually control Margaret. By age 6, Margaret had been betrothed and unbetrothed 3 times. Each negotiation treated her like livestock being examined at market. Teeth? Straight. Limbs? Healthy. Bloodline? Impeccable. Price? Negotiable. The Duke of Suffolk entered the bidding with an offer that would seal his doom. William de la Pole was already unpopular, too friendly with the French, too powerful for a mere duke. But he had something Margaret's mother needed: ready gold and political protection. The deal was struck with the casual cruelty of the age. 6-year-old Margaret would marry Suffolk's son John. Two children who'd never met were now bound by adult ambitions. Suffolk paid £50 for the privilege. In the great halls where these deals were made, nobody mentioned that the bride still played with dolls. The groom was 8 years old, more interested in wooden swords than wedding vows. But their parents were interested in power, and in 15th century England, power was spelled out in marriage contracts signed over children's heads. Here's where the Beaufort curse showed its teeth. Every man who tried to claim Margaret would die before collecting his prize. Suffolk thought he'd secured the future. Instead, he'd signed his own death warrant. The Duke's enemies were sharpening their knives, and little Margaret was about to become a widow before she turned 7. The English hated Suffolk for losing France. They blamed him for every dead soldier, every lost battle, every coin wasted on failed wars. When Parliament banished him in 1450, he fled toward exile. He never made it past the English Channel. Sailors loyal to his enemies intercepted his ship. They gave him a mock trial on a bobbing deck, then separated his head from his shoulders with a rusty sword. It took 6 strokes. Back at Bletsoe Castle, Margaret played in gardens while her mother received the news. The Duchess of Somerset felt relief, mixed with fresh terror. Suffolk's death freed Margaret from one marriage but exposed her to worse possibilities. Without Suffolk's protection, who would claim the Beaufort heiress next? At just 6 years old, Margaret Beaufort was about to be sold to the highest bidder, ASC, and the winner would die before collecting his prize. The Duke of Suffolk counted out £50 in gold coins, the price for marrying his son to 6-year-old Margaret Beaufort. Within 3 years, both father and son would be dead. The marriage market of medieval England ran on simple economics. Noble daughters were investments that paid dividends in alliances. Sons were buyers in a seller's market. The younger the bride, the longer the return on investment. Margaret Beaufort, with royal blood and vast estates, was blue-chip stock in this grotesque exchange. After Suffolk's beheading, his 8-year-old son John inherited a meaningless marriage contract. The boy lasted 3 years before plague took him. Margaret, now 9, had been widowed twice without ever being a wife. Each dead betrothed added to her value. Proven fertility wasn't needed when you had Beaufort blood and increasing desperation. But Suffolk had enemies who knew exactly where to find him. The marriage negotiations never stopped. While Margaret learned to read Latin and embroider altarcloths, grown men haggled over her body, like merchants over silk. The Earl of Cumberland offered lands in the north. Lord Grey promised military support. Each suitor calculated what Beaufort blood could buy them in the wars everyone knew were coming. Margaret's mother played the game with cold precision. She needed protection for her daughter, but also for herself. A powerful son-in-law meant safety in a world where widows could disappear into nunneries or worse. She entertained offers like a merchant displaying goods, always holding out for better terms. The mob didn't just want Suffolk dead, they wanted his entire family erased. News of Suffolk's murder reached court like wildfire in summer wheat. His widow fled with their children, including Margaret's intended husband. But angry mobs don't distinguish between guilty fathers and innocent sons. Young John de la Pole died mysteriously within months. Some said poison, others said grief. Either way, Margaret was free again. King Henry VI watched this chaos with vacant eyes. His madness came in waves, leaving England rudderless between episodes. During a moment of clarity, or manipulation by his advisors, he made a decision that would echo through history. Margaret Beaufort needed a husband who could protect her, but also be controlled. The king had just the candidate. King Henry VI's solution would make things infinitely worse. Edmund Tudor wasn't noble by birth, but he was the king's half-brother. His mother, Catherine of Valois, had secretly married her Welsh servant after King Henry V died. That made Edmund royal adjacent, hungry for legitimacy, and completely dependent on the king's favour, perfect for controlling a valuable heiress. The negotiations moved fast. Too fast. Margaret's mother protested. Her daughter was only 12. The church required consent at 12 but recommended waiting until 14 for consummation. Edmund Tudor heard only the first part. He needed Beaufort heirs to cement his position. He couldn't afford patience. Margaret met her third betrothed at a ceremony designed to impress peasants and intimidate rivals. Edmund was 26, handsome in the way predators often are, with calculating eyes that saw past the child to the womb she carried. The wedding contract specified immediate marriage. Margaret's mother wept. The lawyers collected their fees. What happened next was legal by medieval standards and monstrous by any human measure. The marriage was consummated immediately. A 12-year-old girl who still played with dolls was forced to become a wife in every sense. Edmund Tudor didn't see a child. He saw a vessel for his ambitions, a womb to carry Tudor heirs with Beaufort blood. The court poets wrote pretty verses about young love. The reality was darker. Margaret's small body wasn't ready for what Edmund demanded. But in the marriage market of children, readiness wasn't part of the transaction. Only bloodlines and breeding mattered. The rest was collateral damage. Within weeks, Margaret was pregnant. Her body, still growing, now had to grow another life. Edmund celebrated. He'd gotten what he paid for. A Beaufort heir was coming. That it might kill the child carrying it didn't factor into his calculations. Medieval men rarely lived to see consequences. The Tudor household prepared for an heir, while Margaret faced months of agony. Morning sickness in a body too young for pregnancy was torture. Her bones ached as they tried to grow while supporting another life. Servants whispered behind their hands. Even hardened midwives shook their heads at the swelling belly on such a small frame. Edmund Tudor paraded his pregnant child bride at court functions, proud of his virility. Lords who'd lost the bidding war for Margaret now watched her struggle to walk, heavy with a baby that would tear her apart. Some felt pity. Most felt only calculation. If she died in childbirth, her estates would be available again. When Edmund Tudor first saw Margaret Beaufort, she was 12 years old. Within 6 months, she'd be his wife. Within a year, she'd be carrying his child. Edmund Tudor didn't love Margaret Beaufort. He loved her womb and what it could produce. A child with royal blood from both parents. The math of medieval genetics was simple in Edmund's mind. His mother was a French princess who'd married King Henry V. Margaret descended from John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. Combine those bloodlines, and you got children who could claim England's throne from multiple angles. Edmund saw Dynasty, where others saw a suffering child. By summer 1456, Margaret was heavily pregnant and miserable. Her husband's ambitions had expanded with her belly. Edmund styled himself Earl of Richmond, flaunting his royal connection. He collected taxes with unusual vigour, squeezed his Welsh estates for every penny, and made enemies among men who didn't appreciate an upstart half-blood acting like a prince. But Edmund had made enemies who wouldn't wait for nature to take its course. Wales, in the 1450s, was a powder keg of old grudges and new ambitions. The Wars of the Roses hadn't officially started, but the sparks were flying. York and Lancaster were choosing sides. Edmund Tudor chose Lancaster, his half-brother's side, and painted a target on his back. William Herbert and Walter Devereux were Yorkist lords with long memories and sharp swords. They remembered Edmund's tax collections, his aristocratic pretensions, his pregnant child bride with her valuable bloodline. When the fighting started, they knew exactly where to strike. In August 1456, while Margaret struggled through her 7th month of pregnancy, Carmarthen Castle fell to Yorkist forces. Edmund Tudor was inside. The siege was brief but brutal. When the gates opened, Edmund was a prisoner. His captors showed him the courtesy due to the king's half-brother. They didn't kill him immediately. The plague that killed him struck no one else in the castle. Prison cells in medieval castles were death sentences written in stone and damp. But Edmund Tudor died suspiciously fast. Within 3 months of his capture, he was dead. The official cause was plague. That convenient medieval excuse for murders that needed to look natural. Strange how this particular plague affected only one prisoner. Stranger still how quickly his captors buried the body. News travelled slowly in 1456. Margaret was at Pembroke Castle, another Tudor stronghold, when the messenger arrived. 8 months pregnant, her body racked with pain, she received word that she was a widow at 13. The man who destroyed her body for his ambitions was gone, leaving her to face childbirth alone. Except she wasn't entirely alone. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, had raced to Pembroke when he heard of Edmund's capture. Unlike his brother, Jasper saw Margaret as a person, not just a breeding vessel. He fortified the castle, brought trusted midwives, and prepared for a siege that might come with the baby. Margaret received the news of her husband's death just as the first labour pains began. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. Stress could trigger labour, and what greater stress than learning you're widowed, alone, and carrying a child whose bloodline made it a target? Margaret's body, already pushed beyond its limits, began the final betrayal. January in Wales meant frozen ground and bitter winds. Inside Pembroke Castle, fires blazed in every hearth, but Margaret shivered between contractions. Her small body was failing at the task Edmund had forced upon it. The midwives exchanged worried glances. They'd delivered babies for decades, but never from a mother this young, this small, this broken. Jasper Tudor paced the great hall like a caged wolf. Every scream from the birthing chamber was an accusation. His brother had done this. Edmund's ambition had taken a child and turned her into a vessel for dynastic dreams. Now Edmund was dead, and his victim might follow him. The labour stretched through the night. Margaret's screams echoed off stone walls that had heard centuries of pain, but nothing quite like this. A child giving birth to a child, while armies gathered outside. The Wars of the Roses were beginning, and its youngest victim was fighting her own war in a blood-soaked bed. Hour after hour, the future King of England refused to be born. Margaret's narrow hips, still those of a child, couldn't accommodate the baby. The midwives tried everything. Prayers, potions, manipulations that made Margaret scream even louder. Nothing worked. The baby was stuck, and both mother and child were dying. Jasper Tudor made a decision that would haunt him. He told the midwives to save Margaret, not the child. If a choice had to be made, let the baby die. The Beaufort girl might remarry, might have other children. This baby was just one possibility, but fate had other plans. As dawn broke on January 28, 1457, something shifted. Maybe Margaret's body finally gave way. Maybe the baby found an angle that worked. Maybe God or the devil intervened. But suddenly, after 18 hours of agony, the future Henry VII began his journey into a world already soaked in blood. Trapped in Pembroke Castle with her husband's body not yet cold, Margaret Beaufort was about to endure 18 hours that would destroy her body but forge her iron will. The midwife's face went white when she examined Margaret. The baby was coming, but the mother's hips were still a child's hips. The birthing chamber at Pembroke Castle had been prepared for every contingency except this one. Clean linens, boiling water, prayers copied onto parchment and pinned to the walls. But nothing could prepare for the geometric impossibility of a 13-year-old's pelvis trying to deliver a full-term baby. Margaret had been in labour for 2 hours when the first real fear set in. This wasn't the normal pain of childbirth. In TS, something was wrong. The baby was positioned correctly. The contractions were strong, but progress had stopped. The child was too large, the mother too small. Physics would not bend to royal blood. Hour 6. The midwife whispered to Jasper Tudor that both mother and child would likely die. The senior midwife, a woman who'd delivered hundreds of babies, pulled Jasper aside. Her words were clinical, devastating. The baby's head was too large for Margaret's pelvic opening. Each contraction was damaging both mother and child. The kindest thing might be to give Margaret poppy wine and let nature take its course. Jasper refused. His brother had destroyed this girl. Jasper wouldn't let her die for Edmund's sins. He ordered the midwives to try everything. Cut the baby out if necessary. Save Margaret. The bloodline could survive without this child, but the girl deserved life after what she'd suffered. But Margaret, delirious with pain, had other ideas. Between contractions, she grabbed the midwife's wrist with surprising strength. "Save my baby," she gasped. "Let me die, but save my baby." 13 years old, and she was already thinking like a queen, not a frightened child. Hour 12. Margaret's screams had gone silent. Never a good sign. Exhaustion was winning. Margaret had been fighting for so long that her body was shutting down. The screams that had echoed through the castle faded to whimpers, then silence. The midwives knew this stage. When labouring mothers went quiet, death often followed. They tried everything medieval medicine allowed: herbs to strengthen contractions, manipulation to reposition the baby, prayers to every saint associated with childbirth. The youngest midwife suggested cutting the baby out, a caesarean that would certainly kill Margaret but might save the child. The senior midwife slapped her. They weren't butchers. Jasper Tudor had stopped pacing. He knelt in the chapel, praying to a god who seemed to enjoy watching children suffer. His brother was dead, his sister-in-law was dying, and his unborn nephew might never draw breath. The Tudor line would end before it began, all for Edmund's cruel ambition. When the baby finally emerged, he wasn't breathing. Hour 16 brought a change. Margaret's body, pushed beyond all endurance, finally began to open, but it was too late for gentleness. The baby had been trapped too long. When he finally emerged, blue, silent still, the midwives worked with desperate efficiency. The senior midwife cleared his airways, breathed into his tiny lungs, massaged his chest. Nothing. The other women began preparing shrouds. One small, one smaller. Jasper Tudor would have to bury his brother's widow and son together. But Margaret wasn't done fighting. From the bed where she lay bleeding, possibly dying, she called for her son. The midwives tried to shield her from the sight of the still baby, but she demanded they bring him. With strength that seemed impossible, she held her silent child and did what mothers have done since time began. She talked to him. "Henry," she whispered to the still form. "Your name is Henry. You're going to be special. You have to live. I did this for you. Don't make it worthless." Nobody could explain what happened next. Maybe it was the warmth of his mother's arms, maybe the sound of her voice, maybe coincidence. But the baby gasped, then coughed, then cried, weak but unmistakably alive. Henry Tudor had entered the world as he would live his life, against all odds. The damage to Margaret was catastrophic. The midwives worked to stop the bleeding, but they knew the truth. Her hips had been forced apart, her internal organs damaged. She would live, probably, but she would never bear another child. At 13, she was already barren. This Henry would be her only child. They cleaned the baby, wrapped him in Tudor green and Beaufort blue. He was small but perfect, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin. When they placed him in Margaret's arms, she studied him like a general studying battle plans. This child had cost her everything. She would make sure the price was worth it. The sun was setting on January 28th when Margaret finally slept. 18 hours of labour had nearly killed her, left her permanently damaged, but produced the child who would change England. In her exhausted dreams, did she see crowns and roses, or just more blood? Margaret Beaufort held her son for exactly 10 minutes before political reality tore him from her arms. It would be months before she'd see him again, and years before she'd truly know him. On Palm Sunday 1461, the snow at Towton turned red with the blood of 28,000 Englishmen. A.D. Fee and Margaret Beaufort's 4-year-old son just became the most hunted child in England. The Battle of Towton was medieval warfare at its most apocalyptic. In a blinding snowstorm, Yorkists and Lancastrians hacked at each other for 10 hours. When the snow stopped falling, the death toll was higher than any battle in English history. The Lancastrian cause died in that frozen field, and with it died the safety of anyone with Lancaster blood, including a small boy in Wales. Margaret got the news at Bourne-Castle, where she'd remarried for protection. Her new husband, Henry Stafford, was a gentleman who'd married her for affection, not ambition. But gentleness was weakness in 1461. The new Yorkist king, Edward IV, was drawing up lists of enemies. The Beauforts were near the top. The Yorkist death lists were already being drawn up. Edward IV was everything a medieval king should be. Tall, handsome, brutal when necessary. He'd won his crown in blood at Towton, and he intended to keep it. That meant eliminating rival bloodlines. The Beaufort claim to the throne was weak, but weak claims had started wars before. Young Henry Tudor was living with his uncle Jasper at Pembroke Castle when the Yorkist armies came calling. 4 years old, he watched from the battlements as his uncle's forces were scattered. Jasper fled to Scotland. The boy was left behind, a valuable hostage for the new regime. Edward IV faced a dilemma. Killing a 4-year-old was bad politics, even by medieval standards. But letting a boy with royal blood grow into a man with grievances was worse. The solution was typically medieval: control through wardship. Henry Tudor became the ward of William Herbert, the same man who'd helped kill his father. Margaret's new husband had his own plans for her son. Henry Stafford understood his wife's obsession with her son. He also understood survival. When Herbert claimed young Henry, Stafford advised Margaret not to fight, play the loyal subject. Let the Yorkists think they'd won. Time was on their side. Boys grow up, kings die, fortune's wheel keeps turning. Margaret played her part perfectly. She wrote humble letters to the new regime, accepting their custody of her son. She even attended court, curtsying to the man who'd orphaned hundreds of children at Towton. But every night, she wrote in a private journal, planning for a future where her son would return. At Raglan Castle, Henry Tudor was being raised as a Yorkist. William Herbert wasn't cruel. He saw potential in the boy, educated him alongside his own children, taught him Welsh and English, mathematics and military tactics. Maybe he could make a loyal Yorkist out of Beaufort blood. The knock at the door at midnight meant only one thing, but the Wars of the Roses weren't finished. In 1469, the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, turned against Edward IV. Suddenly, yesterday's traitors were today's allies. Jasper Tudor came out of exile. William Herbert lost his head on a scaffold. 9-year-old Henry Tudor was a valuable piece on a constantly changing board. Margaret saw opportunity in chaos. She convinced her mild husband that they needed to act. While armies marched and alliances shifted, she made her own moves. Secret letters to her brother-in-law Jasper. Hidden gold for future bribes. A network of servants who remembered Beaufort kindness. In 1470, the impossible happened. Henry VI was back on the throne. The Mad King's restoration was Warwick's work, unstable as spring ice, but it gave Margaret hope. She raced to court, finally reunited with her 13-year-old son. Henry Tudor had grown tall and watchful, with eyes that missed nothing. War had made him cautious beyond his years. Mother and son had exactly one audience with the restored king. Henry VI, madder than ever, looked at young Henry Tudor and spoke words that would echo through history. "This is he unto whom both we and our adversaries must yield and give over the dominion." A mad king's prophecy, dismissed by everyone except Margaret. The restoration lasted 6 months. Edward IV returned with an army. Henry VI died mysteriously in the Tower. 2 murdered. Everyone knew. Warwick died at Barnet, fog confusing his army into killing itself. The Lancastrian cause died with them. Margaret's son was more valuable and vulnerable than ever. Jasper Tudor knew what came next. Load the boy onto a ship. Flee to France. Maybe find sanctuary, maybe find death. But don't wait for Yorkist justice. Margaret had one day to say goodbye to her son. One day to give him money, advice, her blessing. One day before the ship sailed into an October storm. When Margaret kissed her son goodbye in 1471, she couldn't know it would be 14 years before she'd see him again, if he survived that long. The ship carrying 14-year-old Henry Tudor disappeared into a channel storm. For 6 months, Margaret didn't know if her only child had drowned or reached Brittany. October winds turned the English Channel into a ship killer. The small merchant vessel carrying Henry Tudor and his uncle Jasper wasn't built for such weather. They'd aimed for France, but the storm had other plans. For days they fought waves tall as castle walls, while Margaret waited for news that never came. The ship finally limped into port at Le Conquet in Brittany, hundreds of miles from their destination. Henry Tudor stumbled onto foreign soil, seasick and scared, not knowing he'd spend the next 14 years on this granite coast. Duke Francis of Brittany saw opportunity in these refugee nobles, valuable pawns in his constant chess game with France. Every delayed letter could mean Henry was dead. Back in England, Margaret Beaufort aged a year for every month without news. Ships sank constantly. Pirates took others. Even successful voyages could end with a knife in the dark at journey's end. Her agents haunted the ports, bribing sailors for word of a Welsh ship carrying noble passengers. When confirmation finally came, Henry lived, was Duke Francis's guest. Margaret wept with relief. Then she got to work. Brittany needed things England could provide: wool, tin, diplomatic support. Margaret began building relationships, writing letters, creating the connections that might someday bring her son home. Her husband, Henry Stafford, watched his wife transform from grieving mother to political operative. He didn't interfere. He'd learned that Margaret's obsession with her son was like the tide. Fighting it was pointless. Better to help where he could, and stay out of the way when he couldn't. The Duke of Brittany had his own price for protecting Henry. Duke Francis wasn't charitable. Henry Tudor's upkeep cost money: clothes, tutors, guards. To ensure the valuable refugee didn't escape, the Duke presented bills to anyone who might pay. Edward IV offered gold for Henry's return to England. France offered gold to keep him from Edward. Margaret offered something better: information. Through her network of merchants and servants, Margaret fed Duke Francis intelligence about English politics: who was rising, who was falling, which alliances were forming. Information was worth more than gold to a duke caught between France and England. Henry Tudor's safety was the price for Margaret's spy reports. The boy became a man in exile, learning languages and lessons no English noble would teach: how to survive on foreign charity, how to smile while captive, how to wait, always wait, for the wheel of fortune to turn. Henry grew tall and thin, with the watchful eyes of someone who'd learned young that safety was temporary. Margaret's new marriage bed would become her war room. In 1471, Henry Stafford died. Margaret mourned briefly. He'd been kind, then married strategically. Thomas Stanley was the ultimate survivor, a lord who'd somehow stayed neutral through every phase of the Wars of the Roses. Marrying him gave Margaret protection and proximity to power. Stanley knew exactly what he was getting, a wife obsessed with her exiled son. He didn't care. Margaret brought Beaufort lands and connections. If she wanted to waste money sending letters to Brittany, that was her business. He had no idea he was harbouring England's most dangerous conspirator. Margaret turned Stanley's household into an intelligence operation. Every servant who could read and write became part of her network. Merchants travelling to Brittany carried coded letters. Priests returning from pilgrimage brought responses. Slowly, carefully, she built a bridge of paper between herself and her son. The letters taught Henry Tudor about England, which lords could be trusted, which grievances could be exploited, how the Yorkist regime was fracturing from within. Mother and son had never really known each other, but through ink and parchment, they built a relationship based on shared ambition rather than shared memories. In Brittany, Henry survived 2 assassination attempts, poisoned wine that killed his taster, a hunting accident that put an arrow through his companion's throat. Duke Francis protected his valuable guest, but Edward IV's gold could buy many attempts. Henry learned to trust no one completely, taste nothing first, sleep with guards at his door. Margaret felt each threat like a knife to her heart. Her letters became more urgent. "Wait," she counselled. "Be patient." Edward IV was strong but mortal. His brothers hated each other. His sons were young. Time was their ally if Henry could just survive. Then, in April 1483, everything changed. Edward IV died suddenly at 40, leaving 12-year-old Edward V as king. England held its breath. Boy kings meant power struggles, and power struggles meant opportunity. Margaret Stanley felt the wheel of fortune creaking into motion. Then came the news from the Tower of London. 2 young princes had vanished, and suddenly Margaret's exiled son wasn't just a refugee anymore. He was a king in waiting. The last person to see Edward V alive was a tower guard who heard the 12-year-old king crying for his mother through stone walls 3 feet thick. Summer 1483 turned London into a charnel house of rumour. Young King Edward V had entered the tower to prepare for his coronation. His little brother Richard joined him. They not for safety. Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, explained. Princes needed protection in uncertain times. The boys played on the Tower Green, visible to Londoners who came to gawk at their young king. Then they moved to the inner apartments. Then they stopped appearing at the windows. Then they vanished entirely. Richard of Gloucester moved fast. Too fast for innocence. He declared his nephews bastards, their parents' marriage invalid. Parliament, stuffed with Richard's supporters, agreed. Within weeks, the Duke of Gloucester was King Richard III. The princes were where? Richard's coronation was haunted by 2 small ghosts. Westminster Abbey had seen many coronations, but none quite like this. Richard III and his queen sat in golden splendour, while whispers ran through the congregation like rats. Where were the boys? Even Richard's supporters shifted uncomfortably. Killing grown enemies was politics. Killing children was something else. The new king's face gave nothing away. He spoke of reform, of justice, of England's bright future. But London's merchants noticed royal servants buying quicklime in quantity. Quicklime dissolved bodies, even small bodies, especially small bodies. Margaret Beaufort attended the coronation in modest grey, playing the loyal subject. But her eyes missed nothing. She saw which lords looked sick during Richard's oath. She noted who avoided meeting the new king's gaze. These men might be useful later. The bishops who should have objected were silently counting their gold. The church could have demanded answers. 2 anointed princes don't just vanish. But Richard III paid well for silence. Bishoprics for supporters, gold for monasteries, threats for anyone who asked uncomfortable questions. God's representatives on earth discovered they preferred wealth to truth. Summer turned to autumn with no sign of the princes. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had taken sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her daughters. Royal guards surrounded the abbey, officially for her protection. Everyone understood the real message. She was prisoner, not guest. Margaret Stanley began her most dangerous game yet. Through intermediaries, She reached out to Elizabeth Woodville. Two women who should have been enemies found common ground in grief and ambition. Elizabeth's sons were gone, murdered, everyone knew. Margaret's son lived in exile. Perhaps they could help each other. Margaret Beaufort smiled when she heard the news. Dead princes meant live opportunities. The disappearance of the princes changed everything. Richard III might wear the crown, but he'd never wash off the blood. Even hardened lords who'd accepted battlefield brutality drew the line at murdering children. The realm needed a new king, one without child blood on his hands. Margaret's letters to Brittany took on new urgency. Henry must prepare, learn military tactics, gather supporters among the English exiles. The throne of England was waiting for someone strong enough to take it from a child killer. Her son, their son, could be that someone. But Richard III wasn't stupid. He knew Henry Tudor was now his greatest threat. Royal messengers rode to Brittany with offers. Gold for Duke Francis if he'd surrender his guest. More gold if Henry arrived in England dead. Duke Francis, old and ill, wavered. His ministers smelled English gold. Margaret's spy network saved her son's life. She learned of Richard's negotiations and sent desperate warnings. Henry Tudor fled Brittany hours before soldiers arrived to arrest him. Disguised as a groom, he rode for France, switching horses at every town. Behind him, Richard's agents cursed empty stables. In France, Henry found unexpected welcome. The new French government hated Richard III and loved annoying England. They gave Henry ships, soldiers, and, most importantly, legitimacy. He was no longer a refugee but a claimant, gathering his forces for invasion. Margaret coordinated from England. Which ports were vulnerable? Which lords would turn their coats? Where should Henry land? Her letters, coded in merchants' inventories and prayer books, built an invasion one detail at a time. Mother and son had waited 14 years. They could wait a little longer to get it right. Richard III felt the noose tightening. He stationed spies in every port. He slept in armour. He executed suspected traitors on increasingly thin evidence. The crown he'd stolen by murdering children was slipping. Everyone could feel it. That moment when a regime starts to rot from within. Christmas 1484 found England holding its breath. Henry Tudor was coming. Everyone knew it. The only questions were when and where. Margaret Beaufort spent the holy season writing letters that would determine both. Her husband Stanley played his usual game of strategic neutrality, not knowing his wife was planning revolution in their bedroom. With England disgusted by a child-killing king, Margaret Beaufort began writing letters that would topple a dynasty, starting with one to her son that contained a single word: now. The laundress at Westminster Palace didn't know the herbs she was delivering contained coded messages that would bring down Richard III. Margaret Beaufort's genius lay in recognizing what powerful men ignored. T5 servants were invisible but essential. They emptied chamber pots and heard state secrets. They served wine and watched alliances form. They washed blood from royal linens and kept silent about its origins. Margaret turned invisibility into intelligence. Her network started small. A maid here, a cook there, women who remembered Beaufort kindness when they were hungry, men whose children Margaret had helped educate. Loyalty bought with bread and compassion paid better dividends than gold. Soon Margaret had eyes and ears in every great house in England. Richard's own servants were reporting his every word to Margaret. The usurper king's paranoia was Margaret's greatest asset. Richard III trusted no one completely, which meant he spoke freely around servants he considered furniture. His midnight ravings about the princes reached Margaret before his counsellors. His battle plans were copied by clerks who owed Beaufort favours. The intelligence flowed through brilliant simplicity. Laundresses delivered clean linens with messages sewn into hems. Merchants' wives carried shopping lists where every third word spelled treason. Priests heard confessions that included military positions. 1,000 tiny betrayals built into revolution. Margaret's handler was brilliant, a physician named Lewis who treated half of London's nobility. Doctors went everywhere, saw everything, and asked intimate questions. Under cover of checking urine samples, he collected intelligence that would topple a throne. Richard's own physician unknowingly shared symptoms that revealed the king's growing instability. The code was almost broken by Richard's spymaster, EPA, almost. Lord Lovell, Richard's chief intelligence officer, wasn't stupid. He noticed patterns. The same merchants visiting the same houses. Letters that discussed wool prices in suspicious detail. He was 3 days from unravelling Margaret's network when fate intervened. A kitchen fire at Lovell's London house destroyed his notes. The servant who started it, accidentally, everyone agreed, disappeared before questioning. She turned up in Brittany 6 months later, set up with a comfortable pension from grateful English exiles. Margaret's networks protected their own. The code itself was elegantly simple. Common words meant uncommon things. Wool meant soldiers. Wine indicated ships. Prayer was code for readiness. Margaret's letters to merchants discussed commodity prices while planning invasion. Her notes to abbesses about feast days set military timetables. Thomas Stanley played his part perfectly, right until the moment he didn't. Margaret's husband remained history's greatest fence-sitter. Stanley controlled more soldiers than anyone except the king. Both Richard and Henry needed him. He promised both everything and delivered nothing, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Margaret let him think he was playing his own game. She shared just enough information to keep him interested, but not enough to compromise her network. When Stanley met with Richard, Margaret knew every word spoken. When he corresponded with Henry, she'd suggested half the phrases. The dangerous moment came when Richard demanded Stanley's son as hostage. The king suspected Stanley's loyalty, correctly, and wanted insurance. Stanley had to choose, refuse and reveal his hand, or sacrifice his son to maintain neutrality. Margaret made the choice for him. Her stepson went to Richard's court, becoming her most valuable spy. Intelligence networks are only as good as their communication. Margaret established 3 separate routes to Henry in France: merchants sailing from Bristol, fishing boats from Dover, pilgrims travelling through Spanish ports. If one route failed, 2 remained. Every crucial message went in triplicate. By spring 1485, Margaret knew Richard's entire defensive strategy: which lords would fight, which would hesitate, which would turn. She knew his treasury was empty. Wars against pretenders cost more than crown jewels could cover. She knew his health was failing, his sleep haunted by small ghosts, his trust eroding. Her final intelligence coup was magnificent. Margaret discovered Richard planned to marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York, to secure his claim. The revulsion this caused even among his supporters was palpable. She ensured the rumours spread, each retelling adding sordid details. Richard denied it, but denials only fed the fire. The last letter to Henry was shortest. After years of planning, coding, waiting, Margaret sent a single word that needed no cipher. Come. Everything was ready. The ports were watched, but watchers could be bribed. Lords who publicly supported Richard had privately promised neutrality. Stanley's forces were positioned to strike either side, or both. The kingdom was a dry forest waiting for lightning. Henry Tudor would be that storm. Richard III felt it coming. He stationed himself at Nottingham, centre of England, ready to march in any direction. His spies reported Henry's fleet massing. His scouts watched the coasts. His astrologers read dire portents. But all his preparation couldn't stop what Margaret Beaufort had built: revolution constructed from whispers and woven from women's work. On August 7th, 1485, Henry Tudor's invasion fleet appeared off the Welsh coast. Margaret Beaufort held her breath, knowing that the next 2 weeks would crown her son or see his head on a spike. Richard III's crown fell from his split skull and rolled through the mud, 2024, straight to the feet of Thomas Stanley, Margaret Beaufort's husband. August 22nd, 1485, dawned grey over Bosworth Field. 2 armies faced each other across a marshy plain, while a third, Stanley's, watched from Ambion Hill. Richard III had superior numbers and position. Henry Tudor had French mercenaries and his mother's prayers. The Stanley forces would decide England's future, and everyone knew it. Richard knew he'd been outmaneuvered before the first sword was drawn. His scouts reported Henry's army was smaller than expected, 18, maybe 5,000 men against Richard's 10,000. But numbers lied when loyalty was uncertain. Half Richard's lords had sent token forces. Others arrived late, deliberately, Richard suspected. Stanley's forces watched both armies, waiting for Margaret's signal. The battle started traditionally. Archers loosed volleys that darkened the morning sky. Richard's vanguard, led by the Duke of Norfolk, crashed into Henry's front line. Steel met steel in the apocalyptic clamour that medieval poets sanitized into glory. The reality was mud, blood, and boys screaming for mothers who'd never hear them. Henry Tudor had never fought a pitched battle. His commander, the Earl of Oxford, kept him safe behind French pikemen while real soldiers did the dying. But battles weren't won by staying safe. As the lines locked in deadly embrace, Henry knew he needed the Stanleys. Without them, his inferior numbers would tell. He sent a messenger to his stepfather. Would Stanley honour his promises? The response was typically Stanley, "Aye. Wait and see. The battle must develop." Commitment required clarity. Translation: Stanley would support whoever was winning. Margaret's husband was playing his own game. Richard saw the betrayal happening, but his horse was already galloping. From his position on Ambion Hill, Richard III watched the messenger reach Stanley. He saw the conference, the delay, the non-commitment. Rage replaced strategy. If Stanley wouldn't fight for him, Richard would end this personally. He spotted Henry Tudor's banner across the field, the Red Dragon of Wales, flying beside Tudor roses. "Treason!" Richard screamed, spurring his horse. His household knights followed, confused but loyal. The king was charging directly at Henry Tudor with 200 mounted killers. It was magnificent, suicidal, and might have worked if warfare was still about single combat between champions. Richard's charge carved through Henry's bodyguard like a sword through silk. The usurper king fought like a demon, his battle-axe splitting helmets and dreams alike. He personally killed Henry's standard-bearer, was seconds from reaching Henry himself. History balanced on a sword's edge. The swing of the halberd that ended the Plantagenet dynasty took less than a second. Stanley had been waiting for exactly this moment. Richard committed, exposed, surrounded by enemies, any one. The perfect time to choose sides. Lord Stanley's trumpets sounded. 3,000 fresh soldiers poured down Ambion Hill, straight into Richard's exposed flank. The king's charge became a death trap. Surrounded, outnumbered, Richard fought with the fury of a man who knew he was dying. Even his enemies admitted he died like a king, sword in hand, crown on head, cursing traitors with his last breath. The halberd that finally split his skull was wielded by a Welsh soldier who probably couldn't even spell Plantagenet. Richard's crown, chapeau, a thin gold circlet worn over his helmet, flew off as he fell. It rolled through bloody mud, past dying horses, between the legs of fighting men, coming to rest in a hawthorn bush. Lord Stanley found it there, still gleaming despite the blood. Medieval poetry wrote itself. The battle ended with Richard's death. His army dissolved like morning mist. Some fled immediately, others threw down weapons and begged mercy from soldiers who'd been enemies moments before. The Duke of Norfolk lay dead. Lord Lovell vanished. A.T. Some said drowned, crossing a river, others that he escaped to Burgundy. Richard's naked body was slung over a horse for the journey to Leicester. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, stood in a field of English dead and accepted a crown covered in English blood. Stanley performed the impromptu coronation with practiced efficiency. He'd been rehearsing this moment, whether he admitted it or not. Margaret Beaufort's son was King of England, crowned on a battlefield with his enemy's blood still warm. The new king's first act was to backdate his reign to August 21st, making everyone who fought against him technically traitors. Practical, ruthless, and perfectly Tudor. His mother would be proud. She taught him that survival required such calculations. Messages flew from Bosworth Field like ravens from a corpse. Margaret Beaufort received hers at Latham House, Stanley's fortress. The messenger was still muddy from battle, still breathless from hard riding. "Your son lives and reigns," he gasped. Margaret fell to her knees, in prayer, in relief, in exhaustion from 30 years of waiting. As Henry Tudor was crowned on the battlefield with Richard's blood still fresh on the ground, Margaret Beaufort finally allowed herself to remember the screaming girl in Pembroke Castle who had birthed this moment through pure will. At her son's coronation, Margaret Beaufort was given precedence over every woman in England except the Queen, but she still walked with the limp that Edmund Tudor had given her 28 years earlier. Westminster Abbey had seen many coronations, but October 30th, 1485, was different. Henry VII walked to his crowning past nobles who'd tried to kill him 6 weeks earlier. Margaret Beaufort followed, wearing cloth of gold that couldn't hide her damaged gait. Every step reminded witnesses that this king's throne was built on his mother's broken body. The ceremony balanced triumph with calculation. Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring roses through matrimony. But he'd waited to crown himself first. He was king by conquest, not marriage. Margaret had taught him that detail mattered. Power seized was power kept. But even as king, Henry Tudor still flinched when his mother entered the room. 30 years of separation couldn't be bridged by victory. Henry VII was a stranger who happened to share Margaret's blood. She'd sacrificed everything for this unknown son who spoke with a French accent and trusted no one, not even her. Their meetings were formal, their affection performed for court consumption. Margaret didn't seek warmth from her son. She sought influence. Henry granted her unprecedented power. She could sign herself Margaret R, the R for Regina, that queens used. She controlled vast estates. She held court like royalty, but she'd traded a son's love for a son's crown, and both knew it. The new regime faced immediate threats. Pretenders appeared claiming to be the vanished princes. Yorkist diehards plotted rebellion. Henry's throne wobbled on foundations of blood and ambition. Margaret proved more ruthless than her son in securing it. The pretenders would keep coming until Margaret dealt with them. Lambert Simnel appeared first, claiming to be the Earl of Warwick. Margaret investigated with cold efficiency. The real Warwick was in the Tower, alive but imprisoned. She arranged for him to be paraded through London, destroying Simnel's credibility. The pretender ended up a kitchen servant, Margaret's idea of mercy. Perkin Warbeck was more dangerous, claiming to be Richard Duke of York, the younger vanished prince. He had Yorkist features, royal bearing, and international support. Margaret's intelligence network went to work. She traced his real origins, a Flemish boatman's son. But truth mattered less than perception. The solution was typically Beaufort. Rather than simply executing Warbeck, Margaret orchestrated his complete humiliation, confession, extracted through persuasion, rather than torture. Public recantation in multiple languages. His wife, a Scottish princess, absorbed into Margaret's household. Mercy, that destroyed more thoroughly than execution. Each threat to Henry's throne was met with Margaret's combination of intelligence and intimidation. She maintained her servant networks, now official rather than treasonous. Former enemies found themselves under subtle surveillance. Potential rebels discovered their plans known before they were fully formed. On her deathbed, she had one final command for her grandson. The years took their toll. Margaret lived to see her son secure, her grandson Henry VIII crowned, her bloodline established. But her body, damaged at 13, finally began failing at 66. She'd outlived 2 more husbands, countless enemies, and the medieval world that created her. As she lay dying in June 1509, the new King Henry VIII visited his formidable grandmother. Barely conscious, Margaret still had steel in her spine. She gripped his hand with surprising strength and whispered her final political advice. Trust no one completely, not even blood. Power taken can be taken again. Henry VIII would remember those words through 6 wives and countless executions. His grandmother's ruthlessness lived on in his reign, magnified by masculine power and unchecked authority. Margaret had worked within the system that brutalized her. Her grandson would break that system entirely. Margaret Beaufort died on June 29, 1509, aged 68. She'd lived through 15 major battles, 5 kings, and personal trauma that would have destroyed anyone weaker. Her tomb at Westminster Abbey showed a serene old woman at prayer. It didn't show the 13-year-old girl whose screams had echoed through Pembroke Castle. But perhaps that was fitting. Margaret had spent her life transforming pain into power, using the very system that violated her to crown her bloodline. She'd been sold at 6, raped at 12, broken at 13, and emerged as the most powerful woman in England. If that wasn't worth commemorating, what was? History would remember her as My Lady the King's Mother, the title she chose for herself. It didn't capture the spy mistress, the survivor, the architect of Dynasty, but it captured what mattered most to Margaret. She was Henry Tudor's mother. Everything else, the trauma, the triumph, the trail of bodies, was just the price of placing her blood on England's throne. 3 days after Henry VIII's coronation, Margaret Beaufort closed her eyes for the last time, but not before we return to where it all began, in that blood-soaked chamber at Pembroke Castle. Now we return to that terrible night in Pembroke Castle, where a 13-year-old girl screamed through contractions that would reshape England. The midwife's hands are steady now as she places the crying infant on Margaret's chest. We know what this child will become, Henry VII, first Tudor King of England. But in this moment, he's just a baby born to a child, both of them covered in blood and possibility. Margaret's body is broken, and we know that now too. Her hips, forced apart before they finished growing, will never properly heal. The internal damage means this Henry will be her only child. Every future pregnancy will end in miscarriage or stillbirth. Edmund Tudor stole her fertility along with her childhood. But watch her eyes as she studies her son. Even through exhaustion and agony, there's calculation there. This baby cost her everything. She'll make certain the price buys something worth having. The 13-year-old girl is already becoming the woman who'll topple kingdoms. Jasper Tudor enters the chamber, sees the devastation written in blood-soaked sheets. His brother did this. Edmund's ambition created this tableau of childhood, destroyed for dynastic gain. Jasper will spend the rest of his life protecting what Edmund damaged, this girl mother and her impossible son. His name is Henry, Margaret whispers. Her voice is raw from screaming but certain. Henry Tudor. He'll be king one day. Jasper thinks it's delirium talking. The midwives exchange glances. Women who birth babies in agony often speak wild prophecies. But Margaret isn't prophesying. She's planning. Outside Pembroke Castle, dawn breaks over Wales. The same sun that rose on a pregnant child now illuminates a mother. But what kind of mother? Not the soft, nurturing kind poets celebrate. This is a mother forged in trauma, tempered by violation, hammered into hardness by a world that sees female bodies as currency. Every drop of blood on these sheets will be repaid. Every scream that echoed off these walls will find answer in battlefield cries. Every prayer Margaret gasped between contractions will be answered with crowned heads rolling. She doesn't know the specifics yet. Bosworth Field is 28 years away, but she knows the shape of vengeance. The baby at her breast will grow up a stranger. Exile will steal him before memory sets. When they reunite, they'll be allies rather than family, bound by ambition rather than affection. Margaret will never bounce this child on her knee, never sing him lullabies, never give him the childhood she never had, but she'll give him England. Watch as she hands Henry to the wet nurse. The separation begins immediately. This child is too valuable for sentiment. He's not her son. He's her weapon, her investment, her reason for enduring what Edmund did to her. Every moment from now on serves a single purpose, putting Tudor blood on England's throne. The midwives clean the birthing chamber, burning the bloodied linens, opening windows to release the smell of agony. In days, it will be like nothing happened here, but everything happened here. The dynasty was born in blood and calculation. The Wars of the Roses found their ending in a child's violated body. Margaret sleeps finally, her son elsewhere, her body beginning its long journey toward whatever healing is possible. In her dreams, does she see roses, crowns, or just more blood? When she wakes, the real work begins. Surviving widowhood, finding protectors, building networks, waiting for the world to turn. 28 years. That's how long between this night and Bosworth Field. 28 years of marriages, conspiracies, letters, and lies. 28 years of walking with Edmund's limp while planning Richard's downfall. 28 years of transforming from victim to victor. The waves still crash against Pembroke Castle's walls, as they have for centuries. But we know what they witnessed in January 1457. We know what was born in that chamber. Not just a future king, but a new kind of power. The power of women who survive, violation to build dynasties. The power of mothers who turn trauma into triumph. Margaret Beaufort entered that birthing chamber a brutalized child. She left it as the architect of England's future. Between those two moments lay 18 hours of agony that would echo through centuries, proof that sometimes the smallest bodies carry the strongest wills and the highest prices buy the greatest triumphs.